You don't even know it's there. But the moment you inhale it, potentially what happens is it already starts the process of causing some ill health into the body. And that's not only humans as well, actually. It does that to animals as well.
Welcome, everybody, to the Safety Spotlight podcast. Today, we are joined with Dr. Nayab Sultan. For those listening who haven't come across his work, Dr. Sultan is a specialist in occupational health with over 35 years of experience. He's advised governments in Africa and the Caribbean, and he is a leading voice on the dangers of silicosis. Dr. Sultan, welcome to the show.
Just Nayab is fine. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
We're thrilled to have you on.
Not hung up on titles.
You've really dedicated your life to fighting what is often described as, I guess, the silent killer, some would term it. What was it that first drew you to this very specific niche of safety?
Yeah, obviously I came into safety a few years back in late 1980s, in fact. At that time, it was mainly safety. People knew about safety. Yes, there was some work and some talk about asbestos, and there was a movement to trying to eliminate asbestos in the working environments. But the issue relating to other occupational diseases was pretty much hit and miss. One of the things that always sort of intrigued me at that time was that asbestos and silica dust, or respirable crystalline silica in particular, they're both types of silicates, so they come from the same family of chemicals. So while a lot of people were focused on asbestos as a very specific mineral, right? There was less interest or less attention paid to the silica side of things. That said, there was a global program for the elimination of silicosis that did exist. There was one for asbestos as well. So the global community was aware of it, but there was very little being actually done in that space. For me, it became very much an issue of real-time exposure came when I happened to meet a gentleman who lived right across the road from my home in London in the UK. And you wouldn't see him very often. And once in a blue moon, you'd see him walk down the 2 or 3 steps to be outside in his front garden. And curiosity got the better of me one day, and I went over and said hi anyway. I knew who he was, but I wasn't aware what he was sick with. And it turned out he used to be on a blasting crew. They used to work on road construction in the mountains up in the Himalayas. He was an Afghan gentleman. And what would happen was they would blast the rock, and these guys would just go running in even before the rocks had settled, and they would be shoveling the rocks without any protection. And, at most they would have a handkerchief or something, right? And so he became sick because of exposure to something. He didn't know what it was. There was no connection in his mind that it was to do with a particular occupational exposure. So when I asked him, he didn't even know which disease he actually had. It was classed as TB. Now, the reason why I mentioned TB is because there's a very strong correlation between silica exposure and development of tuberculosis. Silicosis cannot be treated, and it's a progressive disease, whereas TB is bacterial and it can be treated. So there's a little bit of peculiar difference there. But you can also get a type of TB and a type of silicosis called silicotuberculosis. And that's when the sort of penny dropped, because I remember saying to him, at a translator at that time, and I said to him, "Can you tell me what you used to do for a living before you retired?" Forced medical retirement, should I say. And he told me what he did. And then I asked him, "Did you do any other kind of work?" And he said, "Yes, I used to be a laborer in construction, and I did, different things. I cleaned stuff." And that's when the penny dropped for me. I just thought, okay, there's clearly an occupational connection potentially there, right? So I started asking a few additional questions, and all the symptoms that we associated with silicosis, they were all there, right? Why it was classified as TB is also part of the reason why I was so interested in the topic, because silicosis is quite often mistaken for tuberculosis. Under an X-ray, it looks very similar. And to classify silicosis usually requires a couple of what you call a NIOSH B reader, or somebody who's trained in additional advanced techniques to identify silicosis. So it takes one or two people to do that, whereas TB is typically done much faster and much more easily. So in this particular gentleman's case, I believe that it was misdiagnosis, and I did mention to the carer who was with him to say, perhaps you should tell the doctor exactly what you did for a living, and therefore it may be a little bit easier for them to put two and two together and then realize it was a occupational disease, and it was probably due to silica dust as one of the primary suspects, or culprit, should I say.
It really does go to highlight or show how this issue really lacks a certain level of awareness. I want to take a pause here and dig into what is a silicate, and where are these found? Like, where in the day-to-day activities can we actually find these materials and how they appear in our environment? Because in doing my own little bit of research before this conversation, I was pretty shocked at how prevalent these are.
It is. So silicates are a class of substance, silicon dioxide or quartz, which is what we usually refer to it when we talk about it in a scientific sense. There are several types of silica particles, silica substances. We call them polymorphs. So when you actually look at the types of silica that exist, we typically tend to talk about respirable crystalline silica, right? That's where we have occupational exposure standards or occupational exposure limits, which have been scientifically reviewed. But you have many, many forms of silica, and it's actually the second most abundant mineral in the Earth's crust after feldspar. And it's everywhere. It's in the sand that when we go on a beach, or you'll find it in the rock, maybe it's granite countertops, and we use silica actually in a multiplicity of different industrial applications, making manufacturing of glass, as one example, plastics, bricks, tiles, things of that nature. It's everywhere. It's all around us. And typically, as I mentioned, I was a young safety officer and a young industrial hygienist back in the 80s, early 90s. And at that time, we had a legacy of a lot of buildings in London in particular that were very old. They were from sort of Edwardian, Georgian, even some Victorian times. I know that may not mean much to people without going to Google, but basically buildings that were pre-war, pre-Second World War. And the bricks that had typically been used in the UK had a very high silica content, right? And also around that time as well, they started using asbestos a lot as well in lagging and insulation and things of that nature. So what I found was that as I became more and more active in the field as a safety officer, as a young hygienist, I realized how little we knew in industry. There was a lot of degree of ignorance around it, admittedly. Certain organizations like the Health and Safety Executive, which is the equivalent of, say, WorkSafe BC in Alberta, WorkSafe BC in British Columbia, or WCB in Alberta and other provinces, they had some semblance of understanding, but the amount of effort they were placing in health education and health promotion was a little bit hit and miss. They weren't really looking at things from a preventative standpoint. They were looking more at it from an enforcement standpoint. The legislation was very prescriptive. It said, you will do this, yes or no, and either you complied or you didn't comply, right? And so you dealt with the consequences of that. Whereas here in Canada, obviously, we have more of kind of a hybrid model. We have some things that are very prescriptive. You've got to do this. But then at times it says, well, you can kind of do an assessment and make that determination yourself. So coming back to the issue with where it's found, how it's found, there are certain substances that are particularly have higher grades of silica. Right. You have things like Tripoli, you have this engineered stone, which has become very topical in around the world. I know in particular Australia, I have been dealing with some of our peers in Australia recently, and you can get engineered stone anywhere. The silica content could be anywhere between 75 to 98% crystalline silica content. That's huge, right? Which basically means that as you cut, grind, polish, whatever you do to the surface of the substance that you're dealing with, the moment the dust is generated, then you have almost pure silica in the air. Now, I know, for instance, if somebody says, oh, you've got asbestos fibers, everybody's panicking, they'll suddenly cover their mouths, run out of the building screaming. But, silica is the same. Well, it's not the same, but, the principle is the same, that here's a substance that's airborne. It's microscopic. It's a nanoparticle. You don't even know it's there. But the moment you inhale it, potentially what happens is it already starts the process of causing some ill health into the body. And that's not only humans as well, actually. It does that to animals as well. There's lots of um, reports and studies that show horses get it, coyotes, beavers, cats and dogs sometimes also. The list is quite long, it's quite extensive. But the reality is that it's all around us. It's in multiple substances. It's used extensively, even in making plastics. They use it as sort of a base to solidify and harden. It's like an additive that's added just to give it some rigidity, right? So, but it does become much, much more of a hazard when it's in dust form. That's the key. When it's in dust form, it's an issue. It's not like, say, lead, which the moment you touch lead, you get dermal exposure. It'll go straight into your body, through your skin, into your bloodstream. Silica needs more inhalation for it to be harmful. Ironically, people eat silica in their diet, in supplements. You need it. You need it in your body. So you can consume silica, orally, and it will do some benefits to your skin, your nails, and things of that nature. But inhaling it is a different story.
Right. So as soon as it becomes atomized as a particle, the danger becomes uh, maybe not immediately apparent. As I understand, there can be some delay in the actual appearance of symptoms. In some cases, I was reading a few years, sometimes many years after exposure.
I mean, the reality is that there are several forms of silicosis. I'm just going to quickly skim to my notes because there are a couple of things that I think are important. Typically, here in Canada and across North America, I should say, and the Western world, we typically tend to identify more with what we class as simple silicosis. So you've inhaled the silica dust, the particles go in, they'll lodge themselves in the upper lobes, not in the lower lobes. The the lungs are like, if you can imagine, they're like a bunch of grapes, right? And in the grapes, that's the alveolar sacs, and that's where air comes in, it's exchanged in the body, and deoxygenated blood comes out, and that sort of like deals with your breathing mechanisms. What typically happens is that when you inhale the fibers, the particles, they'll go down, and eventually what they'll do is they'll settle on the alveolar sac, right? So it'll go there, and there's a little bit of a chemical reaction because it's an artificial substance. It's not natural to the body, right? So the body suddenly thinks, oh, what's this? And your white blood cells and, your macrophages, so which are the cells that go and fight foreign bodies, will suddenly rush to that area. So a couple of things tend to typically happen. I'm going to keep it very, very simple. It'll settle on the lung. It's a bit of a reaction. Maybe it's penetrated and it kills that part of the lung, and that's where the lung function goes down, i.e., your ability to breathe diminishes a little bit, right? Because that part of the lung is no longer functional, right? And that becomes scarred, right? And that scarring is what we call fibrosis. Right. The other happens when it's sort of a similar mechanism where the macrophages, these little cells that go and fight bugs and infections and, bacteria, viruses, etc. They also go there. There's an increase in your white blood cells and the body suddenly is in fight and flight mode, right? So the body knows that there's something happening. Typically what tends to happen is that we talk about the symptoms of silicosis, right? You have lung function issues. Maybe you've got chest pain, coughing, difficulty in breathing. You may have a fever and fatigue as well. But the reality is that not everybody is symptomatic. They may be also asymptomatic, which means the fibers are going down and it's doing its thing to the body, right? But you may not actually manifest those symptoms. So you become asymptomatic. Right? So most of the kinds of silicosis that tend to happen is the silica and the simple form. And usually it's about 20 years. Low volume of silica exposure, small quantities, small concentrations over a long period of time. And that's typically most of the construction workers, the guys and girls working in factories and dusty industries tend to be exposed to that particular strain. And in Canada, there's approximately about 385,000 people exposed to silica, which is above what is considered to be safe. I'll come back to that one because what is safe, because that's important to the conversation. We have another one called accelerated silicosis, which typically takes about 5 to 15 years. And that tends to be higher volumes of exposure, right? There's more dust, but the concentrations they may not be huge, but there's lots of it over a period of time. The one that a lot of people are not aware of is what's known as acute silicosis, which is also called, for anybody who's got medical knowledge, is silicoproteinosis. But it's acute basically means short term, right? You've been exposed to such high levels of silica dust and you have very, very little protection, and it suddenly causes absolute chaos in the body. It's like taking a bucket and chucking it in there, right? It's just completely inundated your system. And that can actually happen within weeks. So most people tend to associate silicosis, but it'll take years, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. Yeah, absolutely. If it's the simple form, right? Again, it based on how much exposure you had. But if you've had a lot of it, like in the Hawk's Nest disaster that happened in the US in the 1930s, they were drilling through a mountain and it was almost pure silica, right? And they didn't have any protection. There was very poor ventilation. And so it was not surprising that a lot of those workers who were, it was time of the Depression. So a lot of people were desperate for work, right? So they just said, yeah, okay, fine. We'll do whatever it takes to earn a wage. And so these guys and girls, guys mainly, were exposed to such high levels that quite a lot of them actually died whilst on the project, which was not a very long project. And they suspected that maybe thousands would have suffered from silica-induced illnesses as well. So the reason why I mentioned the issue of exposure is important because how much is safe, right? How much can you be exposed to before it's safe? The reality is, yes, there are organizations who do research. They'll do it in laboratory conditions. Maybe they'll do it unfortunately, they'll do it on animals like rats or monkeys and stuff in the past in particularly. And they would see how much could they be exposed to before it started causing symptoms or illness, right? And what we found is from multiple studies from around the world, there's no real safe amount, right? Either you have it in your lung or you don't have it in your lung. If the moment it's in your lung, it's going to start doing its thing. The reason why I tend to be very cautious with silica exposure is because once it's in, it's in. You can't really get it out. There's some technology that they're playing with in parts of the world, like Australia, where they're going to irrigate the lung, but that has complications itself, right?
Drowning, namely, one.
It's like flushing a car out when you're changing the oil. It's like, come on, that stuff's not meant to be there, right? Problem with silica is that once it's there, even if you don't have exposure to it, it still continues to do its things. It's why it's considered a progressive disease. So, but the longer you're exposed, the greater your chances of getting seriously ill. So it goes from being an acute illness to something that's chronic, long term, and may lead to ultimately to permanent disability. Correct. So
To put it in perspective, when you started out noticing this, or thinking about this as a bigger issue, right? At the time, from what I understand, the conversation around this was not the same as it is today. What has that journey been like for you to see the discussion kind of shift and you yourself being a part of that conversation change? What has that been like?
yeah, I think I'm a little bit of an anomaly actually amongst my peers because I've also been very fortunate that I've been the national advisor of a couple of countries in my lifetime. When I was young, there were very few safety professionals. And those who did exist typically tend to work in high risk industries like nuclear and petrochemicals and maybe like mega projects, heavy civils work. But there weren't a lot of safety professionals. And when I say safety professional, I'm talking about, you know, health and safety, occupational health and safety, industrial hygienists, anybody sort of in that safety space. Um, as a safety officer, I would say very little conversation. There was some information that existed from people like the health and safety executive, as I mentioned, but the conversations were more about, okay, we know that there's an issue, we know it's a hazard. You really shouldn't be exposed to dust, so just protect yourself, right? And they'll kind of alluded to, okay, well, try respiratory protective equipment. This is before we really spoke a lot about the hierarchy of controls. Just protect yourself. But if you've got the resources, then yeah, okay, fine. Separate the workers from the area. Perhaps you can wetten the process so there's less airborne particles in the air. And if you can eliminate it, great. But it wasn't a structured conversation. It was like a suggestion. The other side of me, as the national advisor at the time, I was the national advisor of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the West Indies. And there, my conversations were at a different level because at that time, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, had this joint program for the it was known as the Global Program for the Elimination of Silicosis. So that was a good thing because all of a sudden I've come from being a normal safety officer into the international arena. I'm thinking, oh, they're talking about this stuff. It must be more of an issue. So I started to really pay attention, and I started to look at where the hotspots were. Why are they doing so much in, say, Chile? Why are they doing so much in Brazil? Why are they doing so much in, Vietnam? And that's when it started becoming evident that actually it's not just construction, mining, quarrying, but it's in a lot of industries. And it's not just silica dust exposure causes silicosis. There, even at that time, there was conversations that it can cause other illnesses. People didn't really know what type of illnesses. They just knew that, okay, typically the simple mind of me as a safety officer was, oh, you inhale it, so it must just affect your lungs. Now I'm entering into the biggest arena and they're saying, no, you're inhaling it, but once it's in the body, it's going to go somewhere. It might go into your blood, it might go into your tissues, it might go into your urinary tract, it might go up to your brain or something. It's going to cause more issues. So I suddenly realized the issue of silica wasn't as simple as I thought. And that's where we were stuck in the UK, in Europe, and also here in Canada as well. I've lived in Canada for many, many years, many decades. And we still have the same conversations here in Canada that we were having 30 years ago in the UK. So we have a lot to sort of catch up on, to be very honest. Um, but things are moving in the right direction. Obviously the internet's great for access to information and there's a lot of resources out there, but I think fundamentally we're not really bridging the gap between the guys and girls being exposed in the field and really protecting them. really protecting them, because we're kind of the last line of defense as safety professionals sometimes. Here's a substance right here. If I don't protect those individuals, they're going to still inhale it. They're still going to be absorbing that stuff. Now, I've messed up as a professional, and now that individual has now started the process of change in their body towards getting sick.
Really, it highlights that, having come from a certain background and then moving up to the international level, right? And seeing how those conversations kind of shifted, even just from country to country, right? And between different regulation jurisdictions. You mentioned earlier on the differences between maybe Canada and the UK, right? And then how things are done in the US.
This episode is powered by BIS Safety Software, one of the leading safety and compliance software applications on the market today. With their assets module, you can track equipment, assign tasks, and attach inspection forms all from one centralized system. Schedule forms by time, mileage, or hours in use. Scan a QR code on site to access records instantly, even offline. From vehicles and tools to safety kits and sub-assets, it's never been easier to keep your inventory organized and your records up to date. See everything they have to offer at bissafety.ca.
I'm curious, taking a step back and thinking, okay, if I'm a safety professional and imagine that I see a potential hazard or issue that others haven't yet identified or there isn't enough conversation about, what would you recommend is the first steps to really investigate it and start having those discussions? And I think you're probably the best person to ask this question because this was you, back in the 80s.
Risk anticipation, risk identification is really the key. I have, as you would have mentioned, I'm a doctor, but I'm a specialist doctor, with research in occupational and environmental diseases. I tend to find here in Canada, and I'm going to try not to be rude or condescending, but, to become, say, a construction safety officer, a CSO in Canada, you only need to do one or two, maybe a couple of weeks course. And then you go and you do your OFA 3 or advanced first aid. That's another couple of weeks. You can be ready to go to work in industry within 2 to 4 weeks as a safety professional. And then, of course, there is continuing professional development opportunities. Somebody might want to become an NCSO or CRSP or whatever it might be. So there is a structure that exists for people to progress in their knowledge base. The reality is, in the UK and other parts of the world, to become even known as a safety professional, you might have to do an advanced diploma. When I did it, I had to do a degree. I did an advanced diploma, I did a degree. And only after 3 or 4 years was I able to call myself a safety professional, right? Even though I was studying, I knew what I was doing, right? So the expectations of professionals was that, no, you're going to learn this stuff. You're going to understand hazards. We talk about chemical, physical, biological, ergonomic, psychosocial as the 5 key hazards. You had to take a real deep dive into each of those areas. You had to really, really know what you were talking about. Dust, fumes, vapors, all of that stuff. What I tend to find is that professionals who have perhaps been trained outside of the Canadian model, and I'm just talking generally, I'm not trying to be funny with this. Those trained outside of Canada tend to have greater risk anticipation because they've been exposed to much more in-depth learning and understanding of the dynamic factors, right? Here in Canada, we tend to equip people to be industry ready for work, get to work, provide the protection at work. So it's compliance-based stuff. And now, of course, we're protecting workers too. But the approach is different. So what I tend to find here in Canada, and I've been a HSC manager for big projects, HSC director as well as a professor. I tend to find that when I'm talking to my peers, and I'm talking health and safety professionals in general, the the level of understanding, the level of knowledge may exist to a certain point. They know, okay, silica exists. Maybe you need to have an exposure control plan. There's some additional information that exists. There may be toolbox tools, but the sense of urgency doesn't tend to be there. Why I mention the word sense of urgency is because it's a non-human carcinogen. You alluded to it. It's everywhere. It's all around us. If we were talking asbestos, everybody's so panicky, and the law, the standards, everybody comes down hard on it. And here we're talking about silica, and it's everywhere. And yet we don't take the same degree of controlled care and diligence when it comes to protecting people, including ourselves. I was working as the provincial lead for a huge infrastructure project a couple of years ago here in Vancouver. And I remember the technical manager, who was a PEng, saying to me, yeah, but the dust is not really a hazard. I said, yes, it is, right? We were talking about different types, and he just, very generic. And this is the person who is in charge of a $4 billion contract on behalf of the province with prime contractors doing major civils works. And he's saying it's not an issue. And it's like, no, when we have people who don't have that knowledge making decisions, then it can become problematic. And then also as safety professionals, if we don't understand the importance to have those awkward conversations sometimes, say, with all due respect, I take your point on this, but I just need to clarify a certain number of things. We're talking about respirable crystalline silica. That is a carcinogen. We have an obligation to protect workers and others, whether they are subcontractors, or in my case, when I was with the province, protecting the public as well from our operations. Right? So
There's two components to it. So one is building your risk identification skills. That's a primary. And secondary is actually being willing to have maybe those awkward conversations that, hey, I completely understand where you're coming from, but this actually is a risk, and being able to hopefully point to some data to back that up. But getting in the habit of being okay having those, because it can be awkward to have that conversation when you first bring it up.
Well, like Canadians, we're always polite and apologetic, right? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it's an issue, but the reality is the reality. The truth be told, we can't live in a bubble in life, right? We're going to be exposed to stuff. We're exposed to the sun. We're exposed to all sorts of things. But in the world of work, that exposure is completely avoidable. The disease of silicosis and silica-induced diseases are completely avoidable. So why would we knowingly, wittingly, unwittingly expose people to danger, to potential harm? When just a quick decision, say, okay, guys, don't proceed until you dampen the dust, or get some shroud or some sheeting to cover it over, and then try and do it behind the screen. And oh, by the way, you need to go and shave because you need to wear a nasal half mask respirator with a P100 puck or something, right? Those conversations are not always difficult to have because, to be honest, most of these professionals that we work with in health and safety and our peers, they know. They didn't become PEngs and have an MBA or become educated in some shape or form or rise up the hierarchy because they didn't know risk. No, they knew risk. That's how they succeeded in life, right? So sometimes I feel industry, it's the convenience of just saying, okay, just get on with it, right? I don't want to spend money. I don't want to get a Bowser or get some chemicals or oil that's going to suppress the dust, or how many times are we going to have to do this? Oh my good Lord, that's affecting the profit margins. So sometimes it depends who you're talking to. If it's just a small contractor where every dollar and dime and, really affects the bottom line, yeah, of course, then you have to come up with some other suggestions. And you say, look, okay, fine. Why don't we try this? Rather than doing it, cutting it inside the building, why don't we cut it outside the building, right? It can be a very low cost alternative. But then when you're dealing with other companies, other organizations, you have to say, look, there are regulatory requirements here. There's compliance issues here. You do need to do analysis and sampling. You do need to make sure the guys, have had competency-based training, that they've had their face fit testing, and they've got the right respiratory protective equipment, etc.
It sounds to me like there could almost be, especially with a subject like this, a little bit of maybe frustration from the standpoint of experts when they're looking at some of the work practices that might be going on and the mentalities. When you have a disease or potential for a disease and illness that shows up, 10, 15, 20 years, you were saying, for those that are exposed at low levels. I'd imagine there can be some almost passing the buck a little bit, saying, you know what, we're not going to have to deal with this anyways, because 20 years from now, how are they going to show that we were responsible?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point because, in a transient environment like construction, guys and girls go from one project to another and another and another. It's the nature of industry, right? So they will go where the work is and they might go different parts of the country or even internationally. That's part of where recently I received an award for my work in occupational health and silicosis, because in my other job, I do pro bono work for the Southern Africa Miners Association, and the way that we describe the risk there is oscillatory migrant mine workers. Oscillatory meaning they're going all over the place, right? And migrant mine workers, they might be in Zimbabwe, they have to go to South Africa to work or whatever it might be. We're not in that sort of same space, but we do have a lot of people. How many people live in BC and work in Alberta? Live in BC, work in Alberta, and the other way around. Right across the province, right across the country, right? We have people going back and forward. So who is responsible? Well, everyone. Most of the times people say, well, surely the worker's got some responsibilities. Yeah, the worker's got a responsibility to protect themselves, but the employer has obviously obligations too, the duty of care to protect workers. That's one of the things we lack here in Canada, is something that I've been working with some trade unions in the past, in the UK in particular, and in Botswana as well, is having a national register of workers exposed to certain hazards. And, I've been an advocate to try and get a centralized register held by the government of Canada or some organization that is entrusted by all of the workers' compensation boards or others, parties as well, other stakeholders, to have a register. So when I go from, say, job A to job B to job C, the records follow me. Doesn't matter if I'm working for Mark, or I'm working for Joe, or I'm working for Steve in different stages of my career. It tracks my exposures. And for that reason, I'm sort of collaborating with a service provider in Australia called My Occupational Health Record for that reason, because they kind of figured it out in Australia on this issue with silica and other hazards. They've just developed this register, and the records just follow individuals, and then the doctors can tip into their health record and say, oh, I noticed that when you worked in so-and-so company 5 years ago, your lungs were okay. And then you joined this company and there's copies of their hygiene reports and other things are attached to it. And we can see now all of a sudden your health started going down. Okay. So, people are kind of wisening up. Here in Canada, we're not quite there yet with having a register. But I think that eventually over time, as other countries around the world start putting these in place, they start realizing, oh, there's some benefits to this. We might sort of follow suit. And I hope so. I hope so, because like you said, how do you know? Oh, over 15, 20, 30-year career. Who's responsible? When did I get exposed to that? I don't know.
It's almost, from what I understand, there's this data siloing that can go on in a way, right? So all the information that might have been on record for one employer, once they move interprovincially or different countries, whatever it may be, there's this real issue where that information isn't necessarily following the person to their next work site and so on and so forth. So you take that span of, however many years in their career, and you can really be exposed to a lot of potential um, substances that could cause issues, but nobody at each of the sites would actually know that. I hadn't even thought of that as being something that needs to be tracked.
When I've been, in senior positions as a HSE director, I've had these conversations with, the HR people and say, well, the moment we employ somebody, in essence, we're kind of almost buying into the liability, especially if we know that they're going to be exposed to a specific hazard. And we say, oh yeah, we need a person to, work with us on drilling, or, going to need a cleaner, a helper, or a shotcreter, whatever it might be, whatever industry. You, the moment you just say, okay, just come on in, here's some stuff, off you go. If they suddenly become sick on your watch, in your company, who's responsible, right? Who's responsible? Well, the employers will say, well, I don't know. This guy has been working for 35 years before he even turned up, and he's been with us for 2 weeks, and now all of a sudden he gets sick. They're going to push back on it. They're going to reject a WCB claim. Workers, poor persons sitting there suffering, struggling, and they don't know how to deal with it, right? So the liability issue, transference of liability, and it gets complicated. And so my solution has always been to say, okay, before we even employ somebody in a job, let's do a job hazard analysis or demands analysis. Let's look at the job that they're doing. Are they lifting, pulling, tugging, twisting? Are they exposed to, biological hazards? Are they exposed to chemical or physical hazards? You write that down on the job description. Put it on the job description. So when I'm looking at a potential position, I know that before I even take the job that I'm going to be exposed to some stuff. So before I even enter to send my resume or fill in an application, I'm already conscious that there's going to be hazards I'm exposed to. And then because as an employer, you're going to expose people to more hazards, then you can say, okay, perhaps we'll have a pre-employment health screening questionnaire. Maybe you go for a pre-works medical or something just to check your fitness to work or whatever it might be. Or you might have some basic health surveillance right at the beginning to say, okay, when Mark or Nayab or whoever joined the company, his lungs capacity was here. Here's his x-ray at the start of the job. And then if he suddenly gets sick 2 years into the job, then we can say, well, he was okay when he joined us, right? It could be something that he's doing outside of work. Maybe it's legacy exposures, right? So I know it's a little bit complicated, but the reality is that we're still humans. We inhale it, we're going to carry it to our next job. And then at some point, our body's going to turn around and say, yeah, time out. I've had enough of this. I'm now not going to cooperate with you, and I'm going to now start showing you signs and symptoms, or I'm going to become ill until you fix the problem.
It's scary just to think, of how this isn't, like you said, as far as we know, this is not something that can be reversed in any way. They've got, some trials of things like clearing the lungs with fluid and, but at the end of the day, what we're looking at is something that's probably going to be permanent for people who do get it. So it's scary to think that somebody could be left with this. When it comes to, and you mentioned uh, we were talking about data. I think this ties in well with AI, right? And things that we're starting to see. And from my little bit of digging, you have done some work with AI, and the ability to actually use it for detection of what we've been talking about here. I'm curious, what has that research been like, and what have you found?
So I alluded to the work that I'm doing with the Southern African Miners Association. Basically, it's a regional organization, it's a charity that represents about 10 national associations that represent ex-mine workers and their families, their dependents. You have to remember that South Africa in particular was the epicenter of a lot of the gold mining industry from around the world, platinum as well, and precious minerals. But gold mining was particularly a big thing for the last 250 odd years, several hundreds of years, in fact. So basically, what had happened was that guys and girls will be exposed to silica. They're exposed to multiple hazards, right? So they're exposed to high heat, they're exposed to radon, which is a naturally occurring radioactive material. They're exposed to dusts of different types. Well, which type of dust? I don't know. The dust of whatever it is that we're drilling, right? Diesel engine exhaust emissions, all sorts of hazards being exposed to. So the reason why the AI came into the conversation was because, as I mentioned, the legacy exposures of a lot of these people working in the mining sector in Southern Africa was seen as a death sentence, right? You had these people who were relatively fit. They would go down into the mines, and within 18 months on average, they'd come out and they were virtually incapacitated because they were being exposed to so much hazard, dust and things of that nature, that they would become sick. I also mentioned a little bit earlier that TB and silicosis are quite often misdiagnosed, and it requires different professionals or professionals with different types of training to be able to diagnose these. It was notoriously difficult. In fact, if I put it into perspective, you'll understand why I opted to get the grant funding with UBC, University of British Columbia. Misdiagnosis of silicosis and TB is a real problem in certain parts of the world, particularly in resource limited environments like Eswatini, which used to be Swaziland, or Mozambique and different countries. And what was happening was that these guys would get sick. Somebody would look at their X and say, oh, that's TB. Now, the medication needed for TB is very aggressive. I went diving. I went swimming in a waterfall once in the West Indies, and I got a respiratory infection, and they thought I had TB. It wasn't TB, but they said, oh, you have TB, you must take this. And it was terrible. It made me literally turn orange. My eyes were orange, my pee was orange. I'd feel sick all the time. And then one day the doctor called me and said, it's a non-tuberculous M. avium complex. And I said, what does that mean? Because I was still young. He said, basically, it's an infection that you got. Maybe it was from birds' droppings that went into the waterfall. It became aerosol and you inhaled the protein or something like that. And I suddenly realized, hold on, if that can happen to me just by swimming in a waterfall, and then these guys are being exposed to things and they're also being misdiagnosed. I know how I felt when I was misdiagnosed with TB. I felt terrible. It took me months to recover from that. These guys are already very sick. Silicosis is a very debilitating illness, right? And now you're giving them this aggressive medicine for illness or disease they don't have. So what's going to happen? Right? They've already lost their job, so they don't have any money. They don't have like a welfare system. Either you have money or you don't. You eat or you don't eat. Right now, they're having to spend money to take these medicines, which are kind of expensive, and they're not actually making them feel better. They're making them feel worse. And it would accelerate their decline, and it would actually cause untimely death. That, for me, was a big problem. It's a big problem. It should be a big problem for anybody, because if it can happen in sub-Saharan Africa, it can happen here too. So I was talking to some of my peers in the university space, and they said, look, AI technology is becoming advanced now, and there are certain service providers that can provide you these modules which you attach to the X-ray machine. So when the X-ray is done, it will analyze the X-ray and tell you with a high degree of certainty or percentage score whether it is TB or whether it is silicosis or it is some kind of a. And I was like, oh, I need to know more about this because I've got 2 million people that I'm personally responsible for in that whole 10 countries. There's a lot of people. So fast forward, I worked with the University of British Columbia. We got $600,000 grant funding to get these companies to come in and actually do trials. The trials are really important because the more information you put in, the more it's exposed to this information, the algorithms change, it becomes more accurate, more accurate, more accurate to the point it almost becomes not 100% accurate, but it keeps nudging up the percentage score. We think 60% you might have it. Okay, then it starts 75, 80, blah, blah, blah. So I said, I'm fine with this. We went through the ethical approvals, we did all the stuff. And what we were able to find was that the time taken, which typically for silicosis would take 2 to 3 days, was now being done within an hour with a high degree of certainty. And because we knew also that misdiagnosis, even with the professionals, was very high probability, again, it took a high degree of that uncertainty out. I'm one of these guys who's a little bit nervous about AI technology, admittedly. I find it a little bit daunting. But for the purpose of what I needed it to do, in terms of my work in sub-Saharan Africa, it's really been a game changer. And I hope it will continue to be refined and updated and it'll become more sophisticated. But these are early days. And we are starting to see AI technology being used across the board in health and safety as well. We have software solutions which look at musculoskeletal issues with ergonomics. You'll see the stickman thing following the body and the posture, and
It's it's incredibly exciting to see that kind of, take shape and continuously get better and rapidly. I mean, you were talking there, you said went from 60 to 65 to 70 to 75 to 80. It's very rare for a human to improve that quickly at a specific task.
yeah, absolutely. So putting aside my own insecurity, right? I'm thinking, oh my God, this stuff, it's scary. I'm looking at it from the welfare of the individuals, right? Because I'm thinking, well, hold on. Instead of making this poor person suffer for 3 days, whether they do or they don't have this terrible, permanent disability, this permanent disease that will eventually probably be the cause of their demise, you can fast track that. You can get them straight onto therapeutic, modes very quickly. And so, things like oxygen, something as simple as oxygen. Well, we saw during COVID, oxygen became so rare because so many people had respiratory issues, right? With silicosis, it's the same thing. A lot of the people that, particularly the stuff that I'm doing in Africa, these folk live in villages and they'll go back and they may or may not have access to primary health care. So access to simple stuff becomes more and more problematic. That's why developing countries, even though the World Health Organization says there's only 44,000 known silicosis deaths in the world, it's still a big number. But actually, it's more likely to be in hundreds of millions because certain countries have very, very high rates of silica exposure. But there are so few controls in terms of regulation, enforcement, awareness amongst professionals and peers, the misdiagnosis issue. So the problem is there. It exists, it's real, it's genuine, and we have it here in Canada too. But we are getting better year by year. And I do like the direction that we've taken as a country over the last sort of 3-4 years in particular. A lot more people are talking about silicosis, silica in particular. They're talking about the hazard and as safety professionals. So they're talking about silica, the issues of having proper risk assessments, doing your field level risk assessment, you have exposure control plans and dampening the dust and suppression of it, etc. That crossover is a little bit slower on the medical side, but at least industry is doing better.
And I just want to make sure that you brought up a point there. You said the reporting on average is set, was it 40,000? Was that the number? 44,000 worldwide. But you said you think it could be upwards of in the hundreds of millions exposure, I'm assuming.
In fact, what I was going to say was I have on my own website, I have a couple of infographics that show you the percentages of things. And I'll give you an example. Canada, we have 380,000. In the US, it's 2.2 million. UK is 500,000. Europe is 5 million. India is 10 million. And China is 23 million. What does that mean? That means that that's the number of people exposed to high levels of silica dust, which is known to cause adverse health effects, can lead to acute exposures, can lead to acute illness associated with the disease. Another thing that we need to understand, and it's a big thing here, is we always look for silicosis. Well, actually, in Washington State, they did a study several years ago with 200 and something odd construction workers. And they found that out of that big, large number of people, only one person showed signs of silicosis. The vast majority who developed respiratory issues, which then ultimately went on to become silicosis, developed COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, which a lot of us have. I have it too, because my late father was a chain smoker. I've worked in industry for years. I've been exposed to stuff, as you would imagine, right? So a lot of people do have these illnesses and they don't know why they have it, where they got it from. That's why you sometimes hear the word idiopathic used. It basically kind of means that, well, it's an illness or a disease, but we don't know what caused it. So when you hear that word idiopathic, it means we don't know why you got it, but then the rest of that sentence or rest of that title says pulmonary fibrosis, pulmonary being lung, fibrosis being the scarring of the lung. And that was one of the symptoms we get from silica exposure, as I had mentioned earlier.
So there's, it's to think the spider web of effects that this can kind of have, right? And is massive, right? You said that you yourself have experienced a certain level, just from exposure to an industry to specific air pollutants, right? This is something that we might not really, by the sounds of it, understand at all how broad this effect is, right?
Indeed. So actually, one of the things that I'm looking at working on the infographic that I produce, it's free as well, by the way. It's my first name, my surname.com, nayabsultan.com. Sorry for the
We'll include the link.
shameless marketing. The reason why I mention it is because the infographics are there and it shows you Canada, the percentages and things like that. So please feel free to take that. And my articles are there as well, which I've published in industry journals. So it's in simple English. So you can use that as toolbox talks and share it with your senior members of your team, etc. But yeah, there's silica, as I mentioned, is a known carcinogen. It causes human cancer. It's category A1 carcinogen. And I also mentioned that just because we're exposed to inhalable dust doesn't necessarily mean it's just going to affect our lungs. It can affect us in many other ways too. And there is a lot of evidence to show, and I'm just going to quickly pull it up while we're talking, because I don't memorize all of this stuff. There is very strong evidence to indicate scleroderma. In the lungs, you can get chronic bronchitis, pulmonary fibrosis, you can get rheumatoid arthritis, you can get lupus. They can affect your autoimmune system in many ways. It can also affect your kidneys, and you can get certain cancers like lung cancer and esophageal cancer and things of that nature. So there is a lot of evidence we kind of split it into three. Very strong evidence saying, yeah, you're inhaling it, you're going to get a high percentage chance of getting one of these illnesses or diseases. And then there's suggestive, and then there's possible, right? The absolute conclusive proof is there because it's the world's oldest known occupational lung disease. It's been around for centuries. They've known about it during the times of the mummies, building of the pyramids, right? And so we know that it's existed in different names and different forms. Masons used to get it. Stonecutters, potters got it. So over the years, it got called different things, but it was the same illness. Only about 200 or 300 years ago, we changed the name to silicosis, right? But it's been called several things for several years. So it's here. It's not going to go away in a hurry. There's a lot of things that we can do as an industry, as people, as individuals, as professionals. Are we going to bring it down to zero? Highly improbable. We live in the real world, right? So people do cut corners. We do it all the time. When you're at home, I'll just step on the stool instead of grab the ladder. We tend to have more accidents and incidents at home and in our leisure activities. So people do a lot of handiwork. They'll do DIY and they'll cut something and they're not wearing a dust mask or wearing ear protection or eye protection. The problem is because it's everywhere and it's all around us, we may get exposed to it not just in the world of work.
Right. It's a good it's a good point that you bring up that, think in your day-to-day life, where are the risks, whether that be airborne or people take risks, like you said, all the time just at home. So I think part of the beauty of having these conversations is that it does just that, right? It gets the conversation going and people start to think before they actually act. We are running up on time here. I could absolutely talk about this for much longer, especially when you speak to somebody like yourself that has this depth of knowledge. The questions that I could ask, I mean, I'd have you here all day. But I do want to thank you again for coming on the show. We'll include the links down below for your website. Is there anywhere else that people can find your work and what you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, if they go to, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Um, I do have my website now, which I only set up earlier this year, I think. I've put the articles that I've written there. Some of them are in peer-reviewed journals, so there'll be more scientific stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that is actually deliberately designed for people like us, regular folk who don't want to learn about all of the intricacies of, protein and this and that. I don't care for it. I just want to know, what is it? How can I fix the problem? And those little features were published in various journals and magazines. Are there just for that purpose. It's just a resource. And, people can always reach out to me. I'm always happy to help. I was going to mention that, with BIS safety software as well, we are looking at perhaps doing a series of small courses like Silica 101 or Silicosis 101. So we can start looking at that, which might be a useful thing. We don't have it right this second, but watch this space. I think there's an appetite for this information, particularly if it's authoritative, but not written in such jargon that nobody understands it besides a medical doctor. I think we just have to share the information in simple form that actually gives us the opportunity to do something with that knowledge. So there is changes. There should be some stuff coming from us.
We'll be sure to include the links there. Dr. Sultan, thank you again so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Have a lovely day.
You as well.